Right. Okay.
So I call this P&G meeting to order. First item on the agenda is approval for the November 6th minutes.
I move that we approve.
And I second. And since we both approved and second, do we really need to vote, Kim?
No.
All right. Next item is the inclement weather guidelines review. Steve.
All right. So this is pretty straightforward for you. But I will give you some background just real quick, not to spend too much time on it, but this was always just something that happened in the background. And then about 5 years ago, we had a couple of incidents with inclement weather where members of the community were really concerned about what the thresholds were to either delay or close school, both when it was too hot out and when it was either too cold or too snowy or too icy out. And those happened over the course of the year. And in particular, the real precipitating factor was heat. And if you remember, before we had all of the air conditioning at the elementary level, we had some really serious problems with heat at the elementary schools. We still have a little bit of a challenge at the secondary schools, but it's a little bit easier to deal with. So that's the background for it. So we went through and we built out these inclement weather guidelines. And so probably the one that was the most, took the most time was deciding on timelines. So for instance, on the cold days, the rationale behind this was that we would make decisions in time to make the nightly news cycle, because we wanted to give parents enough time to provide for care for their kids for the next day. So you can see on the cold days, we look, and that's a little bit easier than precipitation just because the weathermen are a little bit more accurate on temperature. And so we look at it by 8 o'clock the night before, we make that decision, we push that out. You'll see that the things under cancellations include but not limited to are pretty standard as we move through there. Snow days, a little bit different than cold. We look at the impact of the snow, we looked at the timing beyond that. You'll note that down at the bottom it says, decision will be made at 5:30 a.m. the morning of a cancellation, with notification by 6. We do, if we're going to delay, we do look at making that decision the night before, when at all possible. So that's the goal behind that. You can see that down here with late start. So if the forecast for that cold or for the snow is such that we think there's going to be a need for the delay, we again do that by 8 o'clock the night before. Early dismissal, obviously a little bit different. It's happening during the day. Just a logistics issue for you. We really have to make that decision by 10 a.m. and that's in order to get the buses turned around and on time. You'll find that if there's a day where we're thinking that there's either going to be bitter cold with wind in the afternoon, or if there's going to be ice or snow in the afternoon, we literally will start looking at that the night before, and we'll have a pretty good idea where things are at, and I'm going to show you how we make that decision. But we're usually well tuned into that before we get to school during the day, because what we don't want to do is have the conditions roll in quicker, because we really can't get them out much sooner. So if we make that decision that we're going to dismiss early, keep in mind our secondary schools start at 9, so our buses are at those secondary schools dropping kids off, and now we got to turn them around and be ready to roll. And the insurer needs that decision by 10 o'clock. We really can't get out much earlier than the early outs that we already have planned. So there's not a lot of space built in there. Same day activity cancellation. This was one that we put in place because there were questions about what happens with after school activities. So again, some uniform decisions, whether that's after school programs at the elementary and junior high, afternoon preschool, field trips, etc. The one where we do allow some discretion on that is at the high school level. And the ADs make those decisions at the high school level. The good news from your standpoint is that they make them uniformly. So if they're going to decide that we're going to do this at Liberty, they've also decided we're going to do this at City, we're going to do this at West. So you don't have differential treatment school to school, but there may be a difference in what happens at the high school level and what happens at the junior high level. So, and Matt works with the activities directors on that. Heat closing, thing of the past at the elementary schools,
Yes.
Thank goodness. Still dealing a little bit at the secondary level, The big difference at the secondary level is all secondary schools have some air conditioning, so there's the ability for us to flex kids and move them around. Our big concern with heat at the secondary level now is that we go until 4 o'clock, so that means we gotta watch it a little bit more than we used to. So that's our issue with both heat closing and early dismissal. Now, here's the two charts that are key. People will ask you about these. There's the wind chill chart and the heat index chart. These both come from the National Weather Service through NOAA. What we're looking at here is this barrier right along the line right here. This is what they call that 10-minute frostbite line. So on this side, and think about it moving away from that line, this is at a half-an-hour range. Obviously, the closer you get to this line, the closer it gets to 10 minutes. And then as you move this way, the closer it gets to 5 minutes. So when you're in this area right here, that 10-minute wind chill line, at 30 to 10 in here, we have a lot of kids that either walk that far to and from school or stand at the bus that long. And so for us, that's that kind of key line there. You can see it's not a nice clean line. But what we do is we work through the National Weather Service. You'll see, and I think you saw last year, whenever I needed to make those changes, I'm sending you what we're reading through the National Weather Service and through NOAA. I have the good fortune to be on the conference call line, which they like to have those conference calls like 3 and 4 in the morning. So we have the ability as school administrators to sign up for that. And so I can hear directly from them. They actually ask us not to talk, just to listen, and then they talk to us. But they share what's going on and what their thinking is. And you can there's I don't know what it is, like a message board. You can type your questions in and then they'll answer them for you. You're just not supposed to be talking when you're on the line because there's too many people online, because it comes out of Davenport and it covers Western Illinois and Eastern Iowa. So on here, we're really looking for when do you get to this kind of market space that's between here, and as you look at these temps here, so 15 to 22, 14 to 21, 12 to 19, we're really looking at where you get to the point where you're crossing that 16 to 17 below with the wind chill, and that winds up being one of those points when we start looking at either delaying or early outing, or if in the case it's going to be like that all day. Then we look at it and we say, what does it look like when they go to school and when they go home from school? If we can keep them in school, if they can either get there or get home okay, then we'll try to make that decision around that. With heat, again, not so much of an issue for us, but we actually, and Kim, you have to help me here, was it 3 years ago we put those monitors in? So we actually asked all of the buildings to work with their staff and identify the hottest room in the building. And then we put remote heat sensors in there. So we can pull it up, we can see heat, relative humidity, and it generates a heat index for us from that on the remote sensor. And so we can look at that and see in the building, where does it sit here? Where we've gotten some pushback from community members in the past is they're like, hey, wait a minute, I'm looking at what it feels like to stand outside in the park and it feels like this. Very true. Our buildings are a bit like pizza ovens. Those bricks heat up, and it's oftentimes far more uncomfortable in our classroom than it may be outside. There may be a breeze outside, and so those numbers may look yellow to somebody who's out in their backyard or sitting on their porch. To the kids sitting in the classroom, it may feel like it's light orange or dark orange. So that's part of our process for making that call. So the nice thing is we've got these published. Our teachers understand them, our building principals understand them, I think our community understands them. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, I've had, I don't know, on average, whenever we have an incident, we're under a dozen calls now in terms of people who are complaining about it. So we have far more, I think, uniform acceptance of our process than we've had in the past. So Kim gets a feel of those. I don't know if you got anything to add to that.
Actually, it's probably fewer than a dozen anymore.
Yeah.
So we did, as I recall, we had an early out that was specific to secondary or specific to high school? I don't
Secondary,
remember,
yeah.
right? And didn't touch the elementary because of how we have the school set up.
Yeah, so if you think about it right now, so before, our elementary schedule used to run like this, and our secondary schedule ran around it. Now, they run like this. So you've got elementary and secondary. So now what we can do is we can keep the elementary running a regular day, and we move the secondary to run inside the elementary day. They actually have a schedule built out for that. So the secondary principals have a schedule, and we told them about it ahead of time, so they built a schedule for it so that they were ready to go. So that way we can send the secondary kids home and then get back to run the elementary bus times. The biggest complaint that I've gotten about it is actually from students who are concerned that the day is really short. But at the same time, what most of our teachers have done is they have modified their instruction and sent more home, which is actually the concern that the kids shared with me is, we're not losing our instructional day, we're just now expected to do more of it at home rather than do it in school. And that's just the teachers modifying the assignments and doing less in class and more homework for that particular lesson.
And so I understand the difference there because of, our current facilities, right? And constraints on busing, but I'm curious as to would there ever be a reason why you would do things different, secondary and elementary, just because of the weather? Because my understanding is today, Cedar Rapids did that, right? They canceled elementary, but not the secondary because of the weather?
Yeah.
And that seems weird to me.
We wouldn't do that. We only do that keep the elementary in for the regular day and move the secondary to that abbreviated schedule for heat.
Yeah.
That's the only reason we do that. Other than that, when we make the decision, it's uniformly impacting elementary and secondary. If it's a delay, they're both delayed by the same amount. If it's an early out, they're both early out by the same amount. If they're canceled, they're both canceled. Yeah, Kim shared that with you this morning. To be honest with you, I didn't even see that, so I was unaware of it. So I haven't had a chance to follow up with him yet to get the logic of it.
And I know that the weather was, I think it surprised people as to how bad it got, because I don't think they had anything announced last night, and then I think they began by saying a delay, and then they just canceled altogether. But it was at the elementary level, which I thought was weird.
What I wonder is if they have, like we do, different start times, and maybe
Maybe they've already had
the
their
secondary already
kids
got
there.
there, or were already on their way, and then it was supposed to get worse until 10 o'clock with
So they
the
figured to
sleet,
keep
so
them there.
they,
Yeah,
and
they
they
may have
decided
decided
not to
hang
send the
on those
elementary.
kids so that they weren't driving home in that mess, but then not bring the elementary kids in. So I haven't had a chance to follow up with Brad yet, but I'll see what I can find out.
I was just curious.
Now. So it's a pretty slick operation now. This used to be a huge process for Kim and I to put together. Now it's really a matter of updating our contacts with the weather, with the news channels, and making sure that that's ready to go. The process itself works incredibly quickly. It used to take hours. How about that one horror story? We actually canceled school. We started with the automatic calling, and we had to suspend it at 11 o'clock because the system was still calling people at 11 o'clock at night, and then we had to resume it the next morning at 6 o'clock, and we obviously had a lot of disgruntled people because you got the call but you didn't, and they weren't sure, is this actually true, because you didn't get a call but you did. And again, this was about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We went to a new phone system, and now literally it'll make all 15,000 calls in a matter of minutes.
Yeah, it's quite annoying when people put their work number, and it's usually a main office number, and we get 20 ICCSD, and I'm like, it's just hang up, it's early.
Hey, my favorite
To be fair, you
thing,
say that all the time.
my favorite part is actually being at an extracurricular event. When we've made the call, and then all of a sudden it's like one of those phone commercials, because phones start going off left and right. And I remember sitting in a basketball game and having all the parents turn and say, "Is this you?" Yeah.
Nice.
So it's really smooth now, but like I said, it's taken a few years for us to get to this point, but it works really well.
I like the note that pops up on the website.
That's nice too.
I do, yeah.
It's a good feature.
As soon as you get there.
Yeah. And maybe just then one more note on that for you. One of the things that we worked really hard at was to try to understand from parents, how do they want us to tell them? And so that's why You can get it as a text, you can get it on your cell phone, you can get it on your landline. We send it out via the
Email.
websites, you can get it via email, so there's lots of ways that you can get it. I mean, that was part of that feedback from Kristen's communication
Yeah.
survey for parents. So, that's that.
All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. The advisory committee guidelines.
So first, let me show you the resources that are connected to it. So you know that we are making the move to new board policies. So we went right to that to start with. So this first one would be board policy number 208 on ad hoc committees. And so that was part of our language. And then there's, exhibit 208. So from a numbering standpoint, it's 1E1 for exhibit. And this has information on purposes and functions of ad hoc committees, roles of the committee members, and how you determine membership from it. And then the other thing that we went to was, this is out of state statute, and so you see the state statute, the SS 280.12 in the upper right-hand corner, and this is specifically about the School Improvement Advisory Committee, which is the only advisory committee that actually has a state requirement that you have one. So we use those, that board policy, and future board policy, and future board exhibit, and the current state statute, and from that, we crafted the guidelines that will live underneath that policy, so you can see the numbering, 2081G. And you'll see a lot of parallelisms if you had a chance to look through that on what is the purpose and the format of the committee. Again, lifting language right directly out of the policies and the state statute. And so I'm just going to walk through these real quickly. So when the superintendent deems it necessary, he appoints an advisory committee to assist the district. Now keep in mind, this is different than a board directed committee. So the board always has the latitude, if they wish to form a committee of any type, any type of subcommittee that the board wants to, that right that the board has. This is for district advisory committees. That I now will have to give them a directive, and we will do that in writing, that outlines the duties and purpose of the advisory committee. Again, we lifted that right out of their language. And certainly that would be a best practice, so they know what it is that they're doing, not just a general, hey, go take a look at, fill in the blank. The function is to give advice. Again, that's cut and paste right out of there. Advice and suggestions should focus on the purpose and duties, and that's to keep them relatively on task. The committees are advisory in nature, have no other duties or responsibilities. It comes right out of their language. May make a recommendation, and then through the superintendent, bring that recommendation to the board. It's my job to receive the report of the committee. I retain the authority to make a final decision on the issue. The committee itself is not making that decision. You want to make sure that you don't cede your authority, either I or the board, to the committee, that we, and then all the buck stops here kind of idea, we have to make that final decision. They're ad hoc committees. That comes directly out of their language, and then again, there's a language on what an ad hoc committee is that's in that policy. They dissolve upon delivery of the final recommendation. So the idea is that they don't exist in perpetuity. They actually have a purpose. And membership, again, taken out of that language, appointed by the superintendent, serve for one term, serve on only one committee at a time. Those are basically designed to ensure that we have adequate opportunities for community members to participate. Wait a minimum of a year to be reappointed to an advisory committee. We want to make sure there's lots of opportunities for people to serve. I can request input on the advisory committee membership from individuals, organizations, or seek volunteers to serve. That comes right out of that state statutory language. To the extent possible and when necessary, expertise required allows, the committee should be representative of the district community and will consider various viewpoints on the issue. I think this is important because there's sometimes we have committees that have people have an idea about where they want to go with the committee. And this gives me the requirement that I make sure that if I know that there are different perspectives on this in the community, that I'm deliberate about making sure that all those perspectives are represented on the committee, so we don't just put a committee in that's gonna come up with an answer that we want, that the committee actually represents the diversity of opinions on the issues within the community as a whole. And to the extent possible and where appropriate, the membership shall include, this is lifted right from our non-discrim language, so all of those categories, students, parents, district employees, representatives from the local community, I'm sorry, this one that comes from the statutory language, the next one that comes from our non-discrim language. This one comes from the SIAC language, and it asks us to make sure that we have as many segments of the community represented as possible. The next one is the one that comes from our non-discrim language, to the extent possible, race, color, national origin, sex, disability, religion, creed, age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and socioeconomic status, right out of our non-discrim language. It's interesting, the SIAC language, which is the state statute, does not include all of these categories. So we made the decision to actually use our non-discrim language instead of the SIAC language because we thought it was more inclusive. So, shall select its own chairperson unless the superintendent designates otherwise. I asked about this with some of my peers. They've indicated that there have been times in their district where they've had incredibly contentious issues, and they felt that it was actually in the best interest of the function of the community to appoint a chairperson because there were some very polarized opinions on the committee. So if our job is to make sure that all opinions are represented, but we're not sure how they'll come to the decision on a chair, we can make that decision to appoint that person. On staff liaison, so we want to make sure that there's somebody in there who's kind of a neutral third party who's charged with gathering information and sharing it with them so that they have a conduit into the district, so that they have the support that they need. That person does not serve as the chair. So that person is just there to help them navigate the process, gather information for them, and provide a resource. There may be other district members on the committee. I can think of a couple committees we have right now that might have 2 or 3 different, either teachers, administrators at the building level, administrators at the district level. So there may be more than one district representative on there. If that person isn't the liaison, then they can serve as the chairperson. And then finally, just a reminder, because I think this has been some confusion in the community, advisory committees don't have to post an agenda. They're not open to the public, and they don't require minutes to be kept. Now, that's not to say that any of those things can't happen, just not that they're not required to happen.
You want to go on record with your?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but I won't get it on the record in the top line there on the second page. That
Yep.
I think we need to just strike the word sex because we have gender identity there. It's redundant and once more.
And actually,
So,
after you mentioned that, I think what I'm also going to do is go back to HR and our diversity office and ask them to take another look at our non-discrim statement in general and make sure that it is inclusive, that there isn't anything that we don't have in there, because we haven't looked at that in a while, and make sure that there isn't anything in there that's redundant. Other questions you guys might have? Not sure what
What's-
one question that came from.
I know just, from experience, right, like what types of committees that we as the board have kind of thrown together or asked you to put together.
Yep.
And I see the difference between an advisory committee that we would put together versus you. I was just trying to get an example of a topic that you would, as administration, would throw together as an advisory committee.
So right now, all of our advisory committees are actually district, they're not board advisory committees. So for instance, our integrated pest management, our school improvement advisory committee, our playground advisory committee. Right now, those are all, the way that we've got them set up, they're all district advisory committees. And I know one of the things, Paul, were you on the board when we talked about the difference between that and task force?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, because it was right when you came on. So about 2 years ago, we had a big conversation about kind of what's the difference, potato kind of thing. And the decision at the time was if the board was going to give a group a charge to do something, that they would create a task force. And that we would, at least from a nomenclature standpoint, separate that from an advisory committee that reported up through the superintendent to a task force that reported directly to the board. So that way, if there was specific work that the board wanted done and reported back to them, and not, through the administration to them, that they would do that through a task force. The one that I can think of that just comes right to the top of my head is the school start time task force. So the board said, we want a task force, we're gonna have that run by a board member. So Lori chaired that task force. Then she went out and she gathered the membership. We made some recommendations to her from an administrative standpoint, but she then worked with the board to flesh out the membership on there and to populate that particular task force. And then because it was a board task force, they were posting agendas, they were running them as open meetings, they were taking minutes and posting those minutes. So that would be an example of something that the board chose to do and didn't ask the administration to do on their behalf.
I guess I get that. I asked the question because, you know, it explicitly talks in here of it's going to dissolve upon the delivery of final recommendation or upon completion of duties, and we have several of those committees that are not finite. Right?
They don't sunset. Yeah, and I think that clearly there are some of those things that we're working on that don't have an endpoint per se, and so I think that would be, you would read that in the purpose statement. You would see that. And so from that standpoint, I think there are some that wouldn't have a clear, it's going to expire on December 31st type of thing. They would have more of an open-ended charge to them.
Okay, it just seems kind of counter to the language then that's in there, because, you know, you read that, it sort of assumes a short-term thing that is going to end, and we have committees that really have no end.
And I think one of the things that I think there is an opportunity for us to look at is I think we have some committees right now that appear to have no end, but maybe should have an end.
Fair enough.
And that, when we went through and we were drafting this, that was exactly one of the things that we looked at is, do we have some that perhaps have not been given a clear statement of purpose, and then absent that, through their own internal mechanisms, just continue to move forward. So I think what it's going to do.
I think you nailed it there, is that the key is up front, here's the purpose of this, and when that's accomplished, that same type of,
Yep.
so let's take the playground committee, right, as a thing. Like you could have a very explicit thing, let's look at surfaces. And then we've done that, okay, that's done.
Yep.
Well, there could be a new playground committee that's, let's look at something else,
Exactly.
and that becomes a new thing.
Exactly.
Instead of, let's talk about playgrounds until the end of time. Right?
And I think maybe one of the things that connects directly to that is, remember that one of the things that it says is, one of the things that it says is that there are fixed terms and you can't serve more than one term. So I think there's an implication in there that some of those committees are going to last more than a week, more than a month, more than 6 months, because clearly you could serve a multi-year term on there. So, and then that there may be other people that are going to be appointed to that. So I'll give you, for instance, there are 20 advisory committees out there right now, by the way. So.
I gotta look for them.
So the CDAC committee, the Community Education District-Wide Advisory Committee, we're required to have one of those, not under state statute, but under one of the Department of Ed regs. We're required to have a CDAC committee. We'll always, as long as we are doing that community ed stuff, we'll have to have a CDAC committee because that's what the Department of Ed says. So it'll be an ongoing committee, but it will have a very specific purpose, and it'll have term limits on it. So we can appoint people for 3 years. They can cycle off. Somebody else can take a seat at the table. We've already defined the roles on that committee. So, for instance, you got to have one BASP person on there. You got to have one person from one of the Parks and Rec departments. So they've already generated their own seats at the table with that. So I think this will play right into that. One of the things that was asked, and I said I didn't know the answer to it, but I would bring it to you, and this is my last thing for you on this one, is how we apply these to the 20 committees that are currently in play. And I had shared with the group that my thought was we would look at each of the 20 committees. We would do things like say, okay, do you all have a purpose established? If not, let's put that in place. Do you all have a timeline established? If not, let's put that in place. Do you all have, and we would go through each of the pieces on here and do the gap analysis on it. But if a committee had, for instance, already appointed their members, CDAC just did that. Now, if CDAC's membership doesn't exactly mirror the membership that's on here, or if they don't have terms that are staggered, like we're asking them to do, we'll ask each one of those committees to go through and take a look at that and put it in place so that when they get to their next appointment round, for instance, if everybody's on there indefinitely, but they're all supposed to be 3-year terms, then we're going to ask them to go through and say, Paul's got a 3-year term, Ruthina's got a 2-year term, Sean's got a 1-year term, and then next year Sean's up, and then we'll replace.
Right.
And we're going to ask them to go through that so that it's not like they've got to
Clean
make a
house.
hard right turn tomorrow, but we're going to give them a glide path to work within this framework.
Yeah, I think that's a hard thing to come in the middle, right? It's very easy to lay it out at the onset. This is how it's going to
Exactly.
play out, because people who have been on these committees who have not had a sunset are going to be like, but I've been working on this for years, and you're going to take it away from me.
And we've got
That's-
some
that's
people
a
that are
hard
on,
thing.
some people that are on multiple committees. So
Yeah.
if we're gonna say, hey, we're not gonna do that in the future, okay, well, when you set up your staggered terms, when you move off, you can't go back on type of thing.
And due to the essence of time, do you all have a problem with us tabling item 3 but jumping to the end policies review? I think that's the
Yep.
one that Steve
Yes.
had quite a bit of
So,
feedback on.
and actually, I'm gonna fold 3 and 4 together, if it's all right
Okay.
with you. So what we are doing right now, and I know that last time we were together, we were talking about this, there was a question about whether or not I'd eaten or bitten off more than I could chew. But we are moving ahead, and I'm giving Kim all of the credit on this right now. So we have the board policies 100 through 900 that are out. We have gone through the board legally mandated policies and correlated those with the new policy framework. Gone through the admin guidelines, correlated that with the new policy framework. And what's left now is to go through things like these appendices and the ends policies and figure out where they fit in that policy framework. And if they don't fit, remember, they're going to move into the 1000s. And so when I look at, for instance, we're talking appendices 2, 5, 7, and 9, some of them are going to fit within there. And then we've got some of those appendices that are going to they're going to be homeless. They're not going to have a board policy to nest under. So we're going to have to write those as a separate policy. The ends policies are one of those. Boards are, if you look at the policy governance structure, there's no requirements for ends policies. They're actually really unique to the Carver process. But I also think that there's probably language in there that's worth preserving, whether the board wants to have them written like that or based on some conversation we've had, if we need to adjust the language that's in there. But we're going to move those into the 1000s, and we're going to bring that back to you, since I'm presuming you don't want to meet on January 1st,
No.
which would be the first Tuesday in January.
Would be my
No.
preference.
So I'm presuming that we want to meet in February. So we plan to bring you the policy binder in February. I know we won't be able to chew through all of it in one meeting, but we plan to bring you that in February. I think the 1s through the 9s would probably go relatively quickly. I think where we're going to wind up taking more time is in the 1000s. Our ends policies will live there, and several of these appendices will live there too.
Okay.
So
Sounds good.
I'm really optimistic. Let's see now, I don't have the list in front of me, so Kim, you're gonna have to help me. So 1s and 2s, 100s, 200s, Kim and I are working on. 3 and 4, Chase is working on. 5 and 6, Amy and Matt are working on. 7 and 8, Kim and I are working on. 9, Kristen Peterson is working on. And then everything that's in the 1000s is like that junk drawer, and Kim and I are doing that too.
Okay.
So,
then with the 1 and 2 in climate, weather, and advisory committee, that
Yes.
has to go before the full board for approval?
So those are both guidelines. They don't require your approval, but what we like to do is put them on the board agenda
Okay.
under the policy and governance board committee report, so that they are public
Mhm.
and people can see them. We have a few minutes to just talk about what we did with them. Everybody knows that they're out there. So that way it's just very transparent from that standpoint.
Sounds good.
Can I make one
Yes.
comment? Because I did kind of go through and look at the appendices.
Yeah.
The Appendix 5, which is near and dear to my heart, having done a lot of boundary stuff. When I look at it, I mean, it even says it in the title, right? Or in the top sentence there. It talks about
Mutually exclusive.
boundaries and facilities.
Yep.
And those two things are very different pieces to me. And that list of 21, some of them are very explicitly one or the other. And I don't know how it's going to transition into whatever the new thing is, but I think they should be separated.
That's a
because
great
they're
idea.
Very different things.
Yep, that's a great idea, and when we tackle these as because they're gonna be in the thousands, because most of these don't have a home in any particular board policy as it's written, I think it'd be a great idea to separate those, and actually have them as two separate standalone policies when we get in there.
Number one, I don't think that needs to be listed anywhere, because I think that's
That's what we do.
that's part of everything we do,
Yeah.
is that you're basing it on available data, but
Yeah.
that's beside the point. But there's some, right, you want to
Yeah.
look at, let's see, I just lost it, I saw it, you know, when you're planning for community use of facilities,
Yep.
that's not a
Not a boundary
issue.
discussion,
Yeah,
right?
strictly facilities.
I'll take a crack at separating those,
Most of them
recognizing-
end up being boundary ones in the
Yeah.
end, but there are a few that aren't, and
Yeah.
just having them all sort of milling about together is weird to me.
Yeah, so I'll take a shot at that, and then when I bring those back in February, recognize we may have to go through that a couple of times to make sure that it fits your expectation.
So then, next meeting will be February 5th, with the understanding that we'll have the policy binder to go through. And given that, will people be able to meet at 5? Because it's going to require a little bit more time before that board meeting.
I'm
I
good.
don't hear any objections,
We have a
so.
board meeting that day.
I
What?
mean, I can't wait.
No? Oh, we don't have a board meeting that night.
We don't?
Paul knows them all.
Well, no, that's why we do the meetings.
Yeah, normally we don't.
I'm just so used to meeting every Tuesday, so.
You realize we've met every Tuesday since August 1st, except the
Yes.
7th and the 20th of November?
So, given that we don't have a board, do you want to leave it at 5:15 or move it to 6? I can do whatever. I mean,
I'm free at 2:30.
what? What?
So I'm free at 2:30, so whatever you decide.
So I say let's meet at 5. That way we'll have the rest of our evening.
Yeah.
We can get out. All right. Motion to adjourn. Is there one on the
So
table?
moved.
Second. All right. We're done, Kim. We're done, Kim. We're done, Kim.